Il cowboy porto a casa una donna Apache ferita, poi scopri il rito di matrimonio. Jack rode slowly through the dusty plains, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the desert. He was a cowboy by trade, used to living alone and surviving off the land. His days were spent tending to his horses, hunting for game, and keeping his small cabin in order. Life was simple, predictable, and, for Jack, peaceful. But today, something felt different. The wind carried a strange tension, a silence that made him uneasy. Even the birds seemed to have gone quiet, hiding somewhere in the shrubs and rocks. As Jack guided his horse along a narrow trail, he noticed something unusual. There were broken branches and scuffed earth, signs that someone, or something, had passed through in a hurry. At first he thought it might be a stray animal, but the deeper he went into the canyon, the more he noticed the signs of struggle. A small trail of blood led him around a bend, glinting faintly in the sunlight. Jack slowed his horse to a walk, his hand resting cautiously on the butt of his revolver. He had seen trouble before, outlaws, wild animals, storms, but there was something different about this. The blood wasn't fresh, but it was recent enough to suggest danger. His instincts told him to turn back, to leave whatever had happened alone, but he couldn't. He couldn't ignore someone in need. Following the trail, Jack soon found the source. There, huddled against a rock and barely conscious, was a young woman. Her clothing was torn and stained, and her face bore cuts and bruises. She looked fragile, almost like a bird that had fallen from its nest. Jack's heart clenched. He had grown up in the harsh West, and he knew what survival meant, but he had never seen anyone in such a state. "Hey, can you hear me?" he called gently, keeping his voice calm so as not to startle her. The woman's eyes flickered open briefly, revealing a mixture of fear and exhaustion. She didn't speak, only blinked slowly, trying to make sense of the man standing before her. Jack dismounted and knelt beside her, careful not to crowd her space. "You're hurt pretty bad," he said. "I can't leave you here. I'm taking you home." At first, she resisted. She tried to push herself up to stand, but her body refused to obey. Jack realized she didn't have the strength to walk. With gentle hands, he lifted her onto his horse, securing her carefully so she wouldn't fall. The journey back to his cabin was slow and tense. Jack spoke softly, trying to calm her. He told her the horse's name, the route they were taking, even about the sunset they were riding into, anything to distract her from pain and fear. She remained quiet, only occasionally letting out a soft sigh or groan. Jack respected her silence. He had learned long ago that some wounds, both physical and emotional, needed time to heal before words could help. He didn't ask questions yet. He didn't want to frighten her further. When they arrived at his small cabin, Jack carefully helped her down. The cabin was modest, a single room with a stone fireplace, a wooden table, and a few shelves of supplies, but it was clean and safe. Jack guided her to a blanket he had laid on the floor, then went to gather water and basic first aid supplies. As he returned, she looked at him with wary eyes. He smiled softly, trying to show he meant no harm. "Don't worry," he said. "You're safe now." Jack cleaned her wounds as best he could. He used warm water, cloths, and salve from a small tin he carried for hunting trips. Each touch was careful, deliberate, never rushing. He could see the pain in her eyes, the way she flinched when he touched certain areas, but he spoke gently, reassuring her. "Almost done, just a little longer," he said. Hours passed. The sun set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Jack lit a small fire in the fireplace, the warmth filling the room. He brought her some food, a simple broth with bread, and waited patiently while she ate. She ate slowly, each bite measured, but she ate. That was a good sign. Her body needed strength, and her trust, however small, was beginning to grow. Through the night, Jack kept watch. He sat near the fire, listening to the wind outside and the quiet breathing of the woman he had rescued. He thought about how fragile life could be. One moment, someone could be safe and whole. The next, everything could be broken in an instant. He had faced hardships before, but seeing another person so vulnerable stirred something deep inside him. In the morning, she was awake, sitting quietly on the blanket. She looked at him, and for the first time, Jack felt a connection beyond words. She wasn't speaking yet, but there was an understanding in her eyes, a recognition that he had saved her life. Jack brought her food again and tried to communicate in simple words and gestures. He pointed to objects, named them, and watched for any response. Slowly, she began to mimic him, repeating his words in her own way. It was a start. Communication, he knew, was the first step toward trust. Days passed and the routine settled into something almost normal. Jack tended to his work around the cabin, feeding the animals, mending fences, chopping wood, while she rested and healed. Occasionally she would try to help him, small gestures that made him smile. She carried water from the well, swept the floor, or helped gather firewood. It wasn't much, but it showed her growing strength and willingness to be part of his life, however temporarily. Jack noticed small details about her. The way she handled objects with care, the way she watched the sunset with quiet fascination, the small charms she carried, feathers, beads, and tiny trinkets. He didn't understand their significance yet, but he sensed they were meaningful to her. One evening, as they sat by the fire, she reached for one of his worn leather gloves, examining it curiously. Jack laughed softly, a sound rare for someone who had spent so much time alone. "It's just an old glove," he said. "Not much to see here." But she only smiled faintly and placed it beside her charms, as if to include it in her own world. Jack realized then that he was learning something too. Life wasn't only about survival or solitude. It could also be about connection, about the fragile, quiet bonds that formed when someone trusted you with their life. He felt a sense of responsibility he hadn't known before. Protecting her wasn't just about keeping her alive. It was about respecting who she was, her past, and her culture. By the end of the first week, she was able to walk with some support. Each day, she grew stronger, and their understanding of each other deepened. Though she hadn't spoken many words, the bond between them was unmistakable. Jack found himself talking to her more often, sharing stories of his past, the land, and the animals. She listened intently, occasionally nodding or giving a small gesture that showed comprehension. Jack didn't know what the future held. He didn't know if she would stay, if danger would return, or if they would ever speak the same language fluently. But he knew one thing with certainty. He had made a promise without saying it aloud. He would keep her safe, and in doing so, he had opened his heart in a way he hadn't expected. The desert outside remained vast and unforgiving, but inside the small cabin, a fragile warmth had begun to grow. It was the warmth of trust, the beginning of healing, and the first sparks of something deeper, a bond forged in silence, care, and the quiet courage of two people surviving together. Days turned into a week, and the small cabin in the desert began to feel less like a lonely shelter and more like a place of quiet life. The young woman, whose name Jack now knew was Ayana, was healing slowly but steadily. Her wounds had started to close, and the bruises on her face were fading to soft shades of purple and yellow. Each morning, Jack would bring her water and food, gently encouraging her to sit up and stretch. She followed his guidance cautiously at first, unsure if she could trust herself or him completely. Jack had never been good with people. Most of his life had been spent with the wide, open plains, the horses, and the occasional traveler who passed through. But with Ayana, something was different. He found himself watching her more closely than he had watched anyone before. The way she moved, carefully avoiding pain, the quiet determination in her eyes, the subtle gestures she made when she noticed something new, everything about her fascinated him. Communication was difficult. Ayana did not speak English, and Jack had only a few words of her language, picked up from a passing trader years ago. So, for now, they relied on gestures, drawings, and simple objects to convey meaning. One morning, Jack picked up a stick and began drawing pictures in the dirt outside the cabin. He drew a horse, a fire, food, and water. Iana watched him closely, her eyes narrowing in concentration. Then she took a small stick and drew her own shapes, some he recognized as animals, others he did not. It was frustrating at times. Jack wanted to ask her about her past, about the attack on her village, about her family, but words failed him. Still, he didn't press. He understood that trust couldn't be forced. Instead, he focused on helping her heal, showing kindness through action. He fetched water from the well, chopped wood for the fire, and tended to her wounds with steady hands. Slowly, Iana began to rely on him, not out of fear, but out of a growing understanding that he was there to help. Despite the language barrier, moments of connection began to appear. One afternoon, Jack noticed Iana crouched near a small cactus outside the cabin. She was examining a tiny bird that had fallen from its nest. Carefully, she scooped it up in her hands and whispered softly to it in her language. Jack watched, fascinated, as she gently placed the bird back in the nest. He realized that she had a deep respect for life, for the world around her, and it reminded him of the first lesson he had learned from his father. Every life mattered, no matter how small. Their days settled into a quiet rhythm. Jack would work on the farm, feed the animals, mend fences, and chop firewood while Iana rested, explored the small area around the cabin, or helped him with simple chores. She was still weak, but each day she grew stronger. Sometimes she would carry water from the well or sweep the floor, and Jack would watch her, impressed by her determination. She never complained, even when her body ached or she struggled to move. One morning, Jack brought her a basket of herbs he had gathered from the desert. He showed her how to prepare them for tea, using water from the well. Iana watched him intently, then repeated his actions, carefully placing the leaves into a pot of water over the fire. When the tea was ready, Jack handed her a small cup and she drank slowly, nodding in approval. It was a small victory, but for Jack, it meant something significant. She was beginning to trust him enough to share in small moments of life together. Evenings were the hardest. The desert was quiet and vast, and Jack knew that memories of trauma could return in the stillness. One night, he heard Iana stirring in the corner of the cabin. He looked over and saw her sitting up, hugging her knees, eyes wide and fearful. Jack moved closer and sat beside her, careful not to crowd her. He put a hand on her shoulder, a gesture of comfort. "It's okay," he said softly. "You're safe here." She didn't speak, but she leaned slightly into his touch, a sign that she was beginning to feel the safety he promised. Jack realized then that healing wasn't just about medicine or food. It was about feeling protected, feeling seen, and feeling understood. Even without words, that bond was growing stronger every day. Jack also began to notice small traditions and habits of Iana's that he didn't fully understand. She would arrange feathers and small stones on the windowsill, creating tiny patterns. She often touched her necklace, a string of beads and charms, as if it gave her strength. Jack watched quietly, respecting her customs without asking questions he wasn't ready to understand. He felt that her world was different from his, and he wanted to honor it, not change it. One afternoon, Iana gestured for him to follow her outside. She pointed to a flat area near the creek and began arranging small stones in a circle. Then she placed a feather in the center and stepped back. Jack watched, curious but careful not to interfere. She gestured for him to join, but he hesitated. Not knowing the rules, he didn't want to offend her. She smiled faintly, then motioned for him to place a stone as well. Jack complied, and together they finished the circle. It was a small moment, but it was significant. Through this shared activity, Jack began to understand that she had traditions, beliefs, and ways of connecting to the world that were important to her. He didn't fully grasp the meaning yet, but he respected it. In return, she trusted him enough to include him, even in ways he didn't completely understand. The bond between them grew in quiet, subtle ways. Jack found himself talking aloud even when she didn't respond, telling her stories about his past, about the animals he had known, and the lessons he had learned from life on the plains. Sometimes she nodded, sometimes she smiled faintly, but each small reaction felt like progress. He realized that human connection didn't always need words. It could be built on presence, care, and understanding. Weeks passed, and Ayana's strength returned. She was able to walk on her own, and her movements became more confident. Jack began to notice small habits forming between them. She would gather herbs and flowers and place them around the cabin. He would bring extra water and help with chores without asking. They had developed a rhythm, a silent companionship built on shared effort and mutual respect. Jack also began to feel a new kind of responsibility. He had always thought of himself as a solitary man, independent and self-reliant. But with Ayana, he understood that being responsible for someone else's well-being was different. It wasn't just about survival, it was about care, empathy, and protection. And he found that he wanted to do more than keep her alive. He wanted her to feel safe, valued, and understood. One morning, as the sun rose over the desert hills, Ayana and Jack sat by the fire outside the cabin. She picked up a small feather and handed it to him. Jack took it carefully, unsure what it meant. She smiled faintly, and for a moment words weren't necessary. The gesture spoke volumes: trust, recognition, and perhaps a small beginning of friendship. Jack realized that healing, both physical and emotional, was a journey. It wasn't just about mending wounds or restoring strength. It was about rebuilding confidence, trust, and hope. And he knew that for Ayana, the road ahead would be long, but she would not have to walk it alone. He would be there, quietly supporting, protecting, and learning from her as well. The days grew warmer and the desert seemed less harsh. Jack and Ayana continued their routine: work, rest, meals, small shared tasks, but the atmosphere had shifted. There was laughter now, small smiles exchanged, and a feeling of companionship that neither had expected. It was a fragile bond built slowly, but it was real. Jack often thought about the future. He didn't know what would happen, whether Ayana would stay or if her past would catch up with her. But he knew that whatever challenges came, they would face them together. And for the first time in a long while, Jack felt a sense of hope, not just for himself, but for someone else as well. As the sun set on another quiet evening, Jack watched Ayana arrange stones and feathers near the cabin. She looked peaceful, focused, and alive. He felt a deep sense of satisfaction knowing that she had survived, that she was healing, and that their bond was growing stronger each day. In the vast, unforgiving desert, they had found each other. And that, Jack realized, was a kind of miracle all its own. The days at the cabin had begun to feel almost like a routine, but for Jack, routine no longer meant loneliness. With Ayana there, life had gained a quiet richness he had never expected. They had developed a rhythm together, Jack taking care of the physical work, Ayana helping when she could, and both sharing small, silent moments that spoke more than words ever could. Jack began to notice things about her he hadn't before. The way she tilted her head when she was thinking, how her fingers gently traced the edges of objects as if to understand their shape and purpose, the way her eyes lit up at small discoveries in the desert. He admired her strength and determination, but he also began to sense a softer side, a kind of quiet curiosity about the world around her. One afternoon, Jack was repairing the fence along the edge of his property when he heard Ayana humming softly. He paused and looked up, watching her move gracefully among the small shrubs, gathering herbs. She was working quietly, but her presence seemed to fill the open space in a comforting way. Jack put down his hammer and walked over to her. "You found more herbs?" he asked, using simple words and pointing to the plants. Ayana nodded and held out a small bundle of green leaves and tiny flowers. She didn't speak, but the gesture was enough. Jack took the bundle and smiled. "Good," he said. "This will help with the tea." She smiled faintly in return, and for a moment the desert around them seemed to grow softer, less harsh. They continued their work side by side, moving carefully, almost in sync. Jack realized that these simple shared tasks were becoming more than just work. They were moments of connection. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire outside the cabin. Jack told her stories of his past, of the time he had lost a calf in a storm, or how he had rescued a colt from a river, and she would listen quietly, nodding or occasionally laughing softly at the humor he found in the hardships. He didn't know if she understood every word, but her reactions were enough to tell him she was engaged, paying attention, and perhaps enjoying the stories. Iana, in turn, began to teach Jack about small aspects of her culture. She showed him how to make simple designs with stones, feathers, and clay, explaining with gestures what each symbol represented. Some were easy to understand, symbols of animals, rivers, or the sun, but others were more abstract, connected to stories or beliefs that Jack could not fully grasp yet. Still, he watched carefully and followed her instructions, respecting the meaning behind her actions. One day, as they sat by the creek gathering water, Iana picked up a smooth stone and drew a small circle in the dirt with her finger. She added lines, feathers, and marks, gesturing for Jack to watch. At first he was confused, but then he noticed that the pattern seemed to represent the land around them, the hills, the water, the paths they often traveled. Jack pointed to the stone and then to himself, indicating that he wanted to learn. Iana nodded and guided his hand, showing him how to complete the design. Together, they finished the pattern, and Jack felt a quiet sense of accomplishment. It wasn't just about making a picture. It was about sharing a part of her world with him, allowing him to understand her perspective. The cabin became a small center of learning for both of them. Jack taught Iana how to ride a horse more confidently, how to track animals, and how to recognize signs of weather changes in the desert. Iana, in turn, taught Jack about the plants, herbs, and natural remedies that had been part of her people's life for generations. He began to understand that her knowledge was practical, deeply rooted in observation and respect for the land. Their connection deepened not just through work, but through quiet moments of understanding. One evening, Jack noticed that Iana had placed a small feather and a stone on the windowsill, aligned perfectly with the setting sun. He watched her silently, and she noticed him. She gestured for him to sit beside her, then held his hand for a brief moment. It was a simple gesture, but it spoke volumes. Trust had grown into comfort, and comfort into something more delicate, care. Jack found himself thinking about her even when she was not in sight. He would pause during his work, remembering the curve of her smile, the intensity of her gaze, or the way she laughed softly at small jokes. He realized that she had become more than a person he was protecting. She had become someone he cared about deeply. Yet he also felt the weight of uncertainty. He didn't know her past in detail, didn't know if her family or village would come looking for her, and didn't know if she would ever feel safe enough to speak freely about her experiences. He respected her silence and didn't push her, knowing that trust was something that had to grow naturally. One day, while they were preparing food together, Iana suddenly paused and pointed to the necklace she always wore. It was a string of beads and small charms, each one carefully placed. Jack looked at it and tried to ask about it, but she only shook her head and smiled faintly, as if to say, "Not yet." He understood. Some things were private, and some stories needed time before they could be shared. As the sun set that evening, Jack noticed Iana gazing at the horizon. She seemed lost in thought, almost reflective. He sat beside her quietly, not speaking, letting her enjoy the moment. After a while, she reached over and touched his arm gently, then placed her hand over his heart. Jack felt a warmth spread through him, a mix of comfort, trust, and perhaps the beginning of something more. It became clear that Iana's presence was changing him. The solitude he had once cherished now felt empty without her. He began to plan tasks around her comfort, to notice when she needed rest or help, and to anticipate her needs before she even gestured. Their lives were intertwined in small ways that made each day smoother and more meaningful. Jack also began to observe her rituals and habits more closely. Gianna would often wake before sunrise to sit quietly outside, arranging small stones and feathers, whispering words he couldn't understand. He watched her respectfully, sensing that these actions were sacred, a way to honor her beliefs and maintain her inner peace. He never interrupted, simply sitting nearby, keeping her company in silent solidarity. Their growing bond was not without challenges. Communication was still limited, and misunderstandings occasionally arose. Sometimes Ayana would gesture for him to do something, and he would misinterpret it, leading to frustration on both sides. But they were learning patience, learning to read each other's movements, expressions, and intentions. Every small victory and understanding felt like a step closer to genuine companionship. One afternoon, Jack noticed that Ayana was sitting alone near the creek, staring at the flowing water. She seemed contemplative, almost melancholy. Jack approached slowly and sat beside her, respecting the silence. After a while, she reached for his hand, then let it rest in hers. Jack didn't speak. He simply held it, feeling the unspoken connection between them. In that moment, words were unnecessary. They began to share more experiences together. Jack showed her how to catch fish from the creek, how to gather firewood efficiently, and how to identify tracks of animals. Yana, in return, taught him how to identify edible plants, how to prepare herbal remedies, and how to use natural materials for small tools. Each lesson was exchanged with patience and care, deepening their mutual respect and understanding. Jack also noticed small gestures of affection from Ayana. She would place a small flower beside his plate, arrange the blankets in a way she thought he would find comfortable, or smile at him when he completed a task. These moments were subtle but meaningful. They were not declarations of love, but they were signs that trust and care were evolving into something deeper. As the weeks passed, Jack realized that he no longer saw Ayana as someone he had merely saved. She had become a companion, a teacher, and a friend. He admired her courage, her intelligence, and her unwavering strength. And though they had not yet spoken openly about feelings, Jack sensed that she trusted him with more than her safety. She trusted him with a part of her world, her culture, and her heart. Evenings were often filled with quiet conversation. Jack would speak about the land, his past, and his hopes for the future, while Ayana would respond with gestures, expressions, and occasional words. They laughed together, shared silent moments of understanding, and began to anticipate each other's needs. Their relationship was becoming a delicate balance of mutual respect, care, and growing emotional connection. One night, as the stars filled the sky above the desert, Jack noticed Ayana arranging small stones in a pattern that mirrored the constellations. He watched in awe as she worked, fascinated by the beauty of her focus. She looked up at him and gestured for him to sit beside her. Together, they studied the stars, pointing and gesturing, sharing the quiet wonder of the night sky. In those moments, Jack understood that their bond was no longer just about survival. It was about connection, understanding, and shared experience. He realized that love in its quietest form could grow from trust, care, and the willingness to see and respect someone's world. Weeks had passed since Ayana had come to live with Jack. The cabin, once a quiet, lonely place, now had life in every corner. There was laughter, shared work, and a calm rhythm to each day. Jack had grown used to her presence, yet he still did not fully understand her ways. There were customs, habits, and small rituals she performed that seemed mysterious to him. But he had learned to respect them, knowing that patience and observation were the key to understanding. One morning, as the first rays of the sun painted the desert hills in soft gold, Jack noticed Ayana preparing something outside the cabin. She had gathered small stones, feathers, and pieces of clay, placing them carefully in the dirt in a pattern he did not recognize. Her movements were deliberate, focused, and calm, almost ceremonial. Jack stood silently at a distance, watching her with curiosity. He wanted to ask what she was doing, but words failed him. The language barrier made it difficult, and he did not want to interrupt a process that seemed important to her. Instead, he observed. Yana moved gracefully, arranging each object with care, her hands steady and precise. Occasionally, she would pause, look toward the horizon, and whisper words Jack could not understand. As the morning wore on, Jack noticed a small change in her demeanor. She seemed more serious, more focused than usual, as if the ritual carried a weight he could not see. Curiosity and concern stirred in him. He approached slowly, keeping his distance, and asked in simple words, "What is this?" Yana looked at him for a long moment. Her eyes were calm but firm, almost as if deciding how much to reveal. Then she gestured for him to sit on a blanket nearby, without stepping into the circle of stones she had created. Jack obeyed, kneeling respectfully, sensing that whatever she was about to show him was sacred. She picked up a feather and held it over the center of the circle. Then she took a small stone and placed it carefully beside the feather. She repeated this with several objects, each one placed with a purpose. Jack watched in fascination, trying to understand the meaning. It was unlike anything he had ever seen. It was precise, deliberate, and carried a sense of solemnity. Yana then turned to Jack and gestured for him to participate. She pointed to a small stone and then to him, indicating that he should place it in the circle. Jack hesitated, unsure of what he was doing, but he could see the trust in her eyes. He picked up the stone carefully and placed it where she had guided him. Yana nodded approvingly, then gestured for him to repeat with another object. As they continued, Jack began to notice a pattern. The placement of each stone, feather, and clay piece seemed to follow a sequence, telling a story he did not fully understand. Yet the intention behind each movement was clear. It was a meaningful act, a ritual of some kind. Jack felt a mixture of awe and respect. He realized that he was not simply helping, he was participating in something deeply significant to her. After some time, Yana stepped back and looked at him, her eyes calm and serious. She then made a series of gestures he did not recognize, pointing to herself, then to him, then to the objects in the circle. Slowly, it dawned on Jack that this was a ceremony of union, something he had only heard of in passing stories of Apache traditions. She was performing a marriage ritual. Jack's heart skipped a beat. He had known her for weeks, cared for her deeply, and now he understood the depth of her gesture. The ritual was not just a formality, it was a symbol of trust, commitment, and respect between them. He felt a mixture of surprise, humility, and a profound sense of honor. He had never considered marriage in his solitary life, but the sincerity in Ayana's eyes made it clear that this was meaningful, sacred, and heartfelt. Yana gestured for him to place his hand over his heart, then hers. Jack complied, feeling the weight of the moment. It was not just a physical gesture, it was a connection of hearts, a recognition of shared trust and care. She then picked up a feather and placed it gently between their hands, symbolizing the bond she was offering. Jack felt a wave of emotion. He had saved her life, yes, but she was giving him something far more precious, a part of herself, a part of her world, and a sacred trust. Jack tried to speak, but words felt inadequate. How could he express the respect and gratitude he felt? Instead, he mirrored her gestures, following her guidance carefully. Together, they completed the final steps of the ritual. The stones, feathers, and clay pieces were aligned perfectly, creating a circle that symbolized connection, unity, and mutual respect. As they finished, Ayana stepped back and looked at Jack, her eyes filled with quiet expectation. Jack realized that the ritual had not been about domination or demand. It was about mutual choice. She had chosen him, and he had the chance to accept. Slowly, he placed his hand over hers again, a simple act that said more than words could convey. He accepted her trust, her bond, and her heart. The ceremony concluded with a shared moment of silence. The desert around them seemed to pause as well, the wind soft, the birds quiet, the sunlight warm and gentle. Jack and Ayanna sat together, feeling the weight of what had just occurred. He understood now that this was more than a ritual, it was a promise, a sacred recognition of care, respect, and unity. Over the next few days, Jack reflected on what had happened. He thought about the trust Ayanna had placed in him, the courage it took to perform the ritual, and the responsibility he now felt. It was unlike anything he had ever experienced in his solitary life. He realized that love was not just about words or feelings. It was about action, respect, and understanding. Jack began to engage more deeply with Ayanna's world. He asked questions, using gestures and simple words about the symbols and objects she used. She patiently showed him how each piece had meaning, how each step of the ritual represented care, protection, and connection. Jack listened attentively, feeling privileged to learn from her. He realized that understanding her culture was part of honoring the bond they had formed. Ayanna also began to trust him with more of her personal stories. Slowly she shared fragments of her past, the attack on her village, the journey that had brought her to him, and the lessons her people had taught her about survival, respect, and community. Jack listened without interruption, holding her hand, offering comfort, and showing that her experiences mattered to him. Their bond grew stronger each day. Jack felt a new sense of purpose in life. The desert, once a place of solitude and survival, now held the promise of connection, understanding, and love. He found himself thinking not just about keeping Ayanna safe, but about building a life together, one that honored her culture and experiences as much as his own. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Ayanna led Jack to the circle they had created. She gestured for him to sit beside her, and then pointed to the stones and feathers. Slowly she whispered words he could not understand, but her tone was gentle, reverent, and filled with meaning. Jack reached for her hand, holding it firmly, and realized that the circle symbolized not just the ritual they had performed, but the life they were beginning to share. Jack felt a deep sense of humility. He had entered her world as a protector, but she had welcomed him as a partner. The ritual had not been about tradition alone, it had been about connection, trust, and mutual respect. He understood now that the true meaning of the ceremony was not in the objects or the steps, but in the willingness to open one's heart and honor another's. Over the next few days, Jack and Ayanna continued their daily routines, but there was a new sense of closeness between them. They worked side by side, shared meals, and explored the desert together, but now there was a deeper understanding. Every glance, gesture, and action carried meaning. They were partners in life, bound not only by survival but by respect, care, and love. Jack began to notice small, symbolic gestures from Ayanna. She would place a feather on his saddle when he prepared to ride, or leave a small stone on his table in the morning. These acts were quiet reminders of the bond they had formed, gentle symbols of connection and trust. Jack reciprocated, finding ways to honor her world, protecting her, and participating in small rituals alongside her. He realized that the marriage ritual had not been a demand or a surprise, it had been an invitation. It was an act of courage, trust, and hope. Ayanna had invited him into her world, and he had accepted, not out of obligation, but out of understanding and respect. The desert, once a place of solitude, had become a place of unity, a space where two people could honor their pasts while building a shared future. As the sun set each evening, Jack and Ayanna would sit together outside the cabin, the stars appearing above them. They spoke in gestures, simple words, and occasional laughter, sharing stories and dreams. The ritual had transformed their relationship, creating a bond that went beyond words, a bond built on respect, trust, and the quiet power of connection. Jack realized that he had learned more from Ayanna than he could have imagined. He had learned patience, humility, and the importance of honoring another person's world. He had learned that love was not just about feelings, but about understanding, care, and shared responsibility. And most importantly, he had learned that true connection could flourish even in the harshest of deserts, if nurtured with respect and trust. The desert air was cool and calm in the early morning, carrying the scent of sagebrush and sun-warmed earth. Jack rose before dawn, as was his habit, but today he noticed something different. Ayanna was already awake, sitting quietly outside the cabin, gazing at the first light spilling over the horizon. She held a small bundle of herbs in her lap, her posture relaxed yet deliberate. Jack paused, observing her, and realized that she had begun to move through her day with a confidence he had not seen before. He stepped outside quietly, careful not to disturb her. When she noticed him, she smiled faintly, and he returned the gesture. That simple smile carried 1,000 meanings: trust, warmth, and a sense of shared understanding that had grown over weeks of survival, healing, and learning. Jack felt a wave of gratitude. He had found something he never expected in the lonely desert: a companion, a teacher, and perhaps the beginning of love. Their routine continued, but it was different now. The bond formed by trust and the sacred ritual had deepened. Jack and Ayanna worked side by side, prepared meals together, and shared stories in gestures, expressions, and simple words. The small cabin had become a home, filled with laughter, quiet reflection, and a sense of harmony. Even the wind through the desert seemed softer, carrying their shared rhythm across the land. One morning, Jack decided to teach Ayanna something new. He led her to the small pasture behind the cabin, where the horses grazed. "Watch," he said, pointing to the horses as he demonstrated a simple task, guiding them into a fenced area for feeding. Ayanna observed carefully, then tried herself, mimicking his movements. She stumbled at first, but Jack offered gentle guidance, showing patience and encouragement. Soon, she moved with skill and confidence, her eyes bright with achievement. Jack realized that these moments, though small, were significant. They were learning from each other, teaching and sharing, building a life together through simple acts of cooperation. The physical tasks, once mundane, had become expressions of care, trust, and shared purpose. Each day brought new lessons, new challenges, and new joys. Evenings were their favorite time. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the desert in hues of orange and pink, Jack and Ayanna would sit by the fire outside the cabin. They shared simple meals, passing food to each other, laughing at small mistakes, or simply enjoying the silence. Jack often found himself telling stories from his past, tales of hardship, survival, and humor, while Ayanna listened intently, her expressions revealing understanding, curiosity, and sometimes gentle amusement. Ayanna, in turn, shared more of her traditions and stories, teaching Jack the meanings behind the symbols she used in her rituals. She showed him how to prepare herbal remedies, how to arrange stones and feathers, and how to honor the land with small gestures of respect. Jack listened carefully, practicing her methods with reverence and patience. Each shared activity was a step deeper into her world, a bridge connecting their two lives. One evening, as they sat together watching the stars appear above the desert, Ayanna gestured for Jack to follow her to the small circle they had created during the ritual. She pointed to the stones and feathers, then to them, and finally to the sky. Slowly, Jack understood that she was showing him a connection, not just to each other, but to the larger world, the land, and the sky above. The ritual had not been a one-time event. It was a living practice, a way of honoring the present while respecting the past. Jack reached for her hand, holding it gently. She rested her other hand on top of his, and for a moment they simply sat in silence. The desert was quiet, the stars bright and endless, and the sense of connection between them was deep and unspoken. In that moment, Jack realized that he had found a companion who not only survived alongside him, but understood him in ways he had never known possible. Days turned into weeks, and life continued in a steady rhythm. Jack and Ayanna faced challenges: harsh weather, occasional wild animals, and the constant demands of survival. But each challenge was met together. They learned to anticipate each other's needs, communicate through gestures, and rely on mutual understanding. Their relationship was no longer about protection alone. It had grown into true partnership. One afternoon, as they rested near the creek after a long morning of work, Ayanna suddenly pointed to a flower and then to Jack. She plucked it gently and placed it in his hand. Jack looked at her in surprise. The gesture was simple, yet it spoke of care, recognition, and a shared bond. He tucked the flower into his shirt pocket, feeling a warmth in his chest. This small act, like many others, was a symbol of the life they were building together: quiet, meaningful, and grounded in mutual respect. Jack began to reflect on what their journey had taught him. He had entered this experience as a solitary man, accustomed to the harshness of the desert and the simplicity of survival. But Ayanna had opened his eyes to new possibilities: connection, cultural richness, and the power of trust and understanding. He realized that life could be fuller, deeper, and more meaningful when shared with someone who respected and challenged him in gentle ways. Ayanna, too, had grown through their time together. She had regained strength, confidence, and trust. She moved freely, worked alongside Jack, and shared her traditions without fear. The desert, once a place of danger and uncertainty, had become a sanctuary, a space where she could heal, learn, and thrive. Her bond with Jack had transformed her isolation into connection, her fear into trust, and her survival into a shared life. One evening, as the sky deepened into twilight, Jack and Ayanna sat near the fire, the warmth surrounding them. He looked at her and saw not just the woman he had rescued, but a companion, a teacher, and a partner. She had chosen him through her ritual, and he had chosen her through his acceptance, respect, and care. The bond between them was profound, grounded in shared experience, mutual understanding, and quiet love. Jack reached out and gently took her hand. She responded by leaning slightly into him, resting her head on his shoulder. It was a small gesture, but it carried all the meaning of their journey: trust, care, and the unspoken promise of a shared future. In that moment, the hardships, the challenges, and the uncertainties faded into the background. What mattered was the bond they had created, the life they had built together, and the respect that underpinned everything. The following days were filled with continued growth and shared experiences. Jack taught Ayanna more about the land, the animals, and the practical skills needed for life in the desert. She, in turn, shared more stories, traditions, and methods for connecting with nature. Each day was a lesson, an opportunity to learn from one another, and a chance to deepen their bond. Jack also began to plan for the future in a way he never had before. He thought about ways to expand their small cabin, improve their farm, and ensure that they could live comfortably and safely together. These plans were no longer solitary. They included Ayanna, respecting her knowledge, her traditions, and her input. Together, they began to build a life that honored both of their experiences and cultures. One morning, as they worked side by side, Ayanna gestured for Jack to stop and look at the horizon. The desert stretched endlessly, but the view was softened by the gentle light of the rising sun. She pointed to the land, then to him, and finally to the small circle they had created months before. Slowly, Jack understood her meaning. The land, their shared life, and the bond they had formed were all interconnected. He nodded, feeling a deep sense of gratitude and understanding. The bond between them became a source of strength. When storms came, they faced them together. When tasks seemed overwhelming, they divided the work, supported one another, and encouraged each other. Their relationship was built not on grand gestures, but on small, consistent acts of care, trust, and mutual respect. Each day reinforced their connection, deepening the understanding that survival alone was not enough. Life was richer when shared. Even in moments of quiet, the depth of their bond was evident. Jack often caught Ayanna looking at him with a mixture of trust, curiosity, and warmth. He felt the same toward her, recognizing her courage, wisdom, and the resilience that had carried her through so much. They had become more than companions. They were partners in every sense, linked by choice, respect, and shared experience. One evening, as the stars filled the sky above the desert, Jack and Ayanna sat together outside the cabin, reflecting on their journey. They spoke in gestures, simple words, and gentle laughter. The hardships they had faced now seemed like distant memories, replaced by the quiet joy of companionship. They had found safety, understanding, and love in one another, a life built on trust, patience, and mutual respect. Jack realized that the desert, once a place of solitude and challenge, had become a home filled with meaning. He had entered this experience as a protector, but he had found much more. A companion who taught him the value of culture, trust, and connection. Yana had healed, thrived, and chosen to share her life with him, and in return he had opened his heart fully, embracing her world and her presence. As they sat together that night, hands intertwined, Jack felt a profound sense of peace. The journey they had undertaken, from rescue and healing to trust, understanding, and ritual, had brought them to this moment. They had survived the hardships of the desert, faced challenges together, and created a bond that could withstand the trials of life. In the quiet glow of the fire, Jack whispered softly, "We'll face whatever comes together." Yana leaned closer, resting her head on his shoulder, and whispered words he could not fully understand, yet their meaning was clear: trust, love, and shared life. The desert stretched endlessly around them, but for Jack and Ayanna, the vastness no longer felt lonely. It was a space of possibility, connection, and growth. Together, they had discovered not only survival but companionship, understanding, and the quiet, enduring power of love built on trust, respect, and shared experience. And so, as the stars shone above and the fire crackled warmly beside them, Jack and Ayanna began the next chapter of their life, side by side, heart to heart, and bound by a bond that had grown stronger with every day they spent together. They had found in each other not just safety, but home, not just companionship, but understanding, and not just love, but a shared life rooted in respect and trust.